Hello, I'm glad to have you with us. I'm Danielle Walker, Senior Reporter. Hello, I'm glad to have you with us. I'm Danielle Walker, Senior Reporter, SC Magazine. I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast entitled 10 Tips for Successful SIEM Deployment. This session is sponsored by EIQ Networks and is part of our larger SIEM eSymposium. Our speaker today is Kevin Lant. He's the product manager at EIQ Networks, and he'll offer some advice on avoiding common pitfalls in SIEM deployment. In addition to this, he'll be discussing the many options available in the market today for your organization's specific needs. Kevin has over a decade of experience in engineering, marketing, and product management roles, and he has worked with a variety of customers to help them overcome their security challenges. With that, I'll hand things over to Kevin.
Thanks, Danielle. Today what I'd like to talk about is just start with what are the goals of a SIEM deployment, what are we trying to accomplish. Next, I'll talk about some of the common challenges that we see that are preventing people from meeting these goals. And then I'll offer some tips that hopefully will be helpful to you as you look forward to a successful SIEM deployment. Of course, at the end, I'll also mention a bit more about EIQ and how we're trying to help organizations meet their security and compliance goals. So what is the point of SIEM? Well, traditionally, SIEM is deployed to meet a few different objectives. The first is usually collecting log data from separate silos all over the organization and bringing them together in a central repository. So I've got a few examples here of the different types of data you might be trying to collect. Typically, these exist in separate buckets. They don't communicate with each other, and you don't get a lot of value add by being able to see all this data at once. So that's a big goal of SIEM. Secondly, once you've collected all that data, you want to be able to analyze it and detect advanced threats. A lot of today's threats can evade traditional security products. It used to be you could just install anti-malware, detect infections, quarantine that machine, and you were all set. But today, attackers are a lot more advanced. They know how to get around signature-based technologies. So the goal of implementing a SIEM is to be able to detect those advanced threats. And then because of that, a lot of the regulations today require some level of log auditing and SIEM. So one of the big goals for people when they're implementing a SIEM is to be able to hit that checkbox and make sure that they're meeting the burden of regulatory requirements like PCI and HIPAA and FISMA for the U.S. government. So if you're attending a SIEM eSymposium today, I assume there's a good chance you're interested in meeting in one or more of these goals. And so we'll talk about these in a little more depth. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations have had a negative experience or two with SIEM implementation. There are some hurdles that need to be overcome to do it successfully. Those include the complexity of the products, the surprise costs that weren't accounted for, and the ability to get good proactive security value from the product. So we'll talk about each of these challenges, and I'll offer a few tips that we've seen based on our experience trying to help customers. The number one issue we see is product complexity. In this particular survey I've chosen as an example, 44% of the organizations that were surveyed said complexity of SIEM products was their number one challenge. And you can do a Google search on SIEM complexity and you'll see all kinds of survey results that back this up with similar results. It's usually the biggest challenge people face. SIEM technology can be a challenge when it comes to data collection, as well as tuning alerts and reporting and building all the correlation rules. These tasks tend to be much more complex and take a lot more time than people plan for. And that's why it's such a big challenge. So one of the biggest things you can do to ease this complexity is to really do your homework ahead of time. The big thing you need to do is understand what your use cases are, what problem are you trying to solve specifically. Make sure you document that, and then plan all of your data collection accordingly. You'll need to go out and adjust the logging policies on all the devices you're collecting from, And you want to do that ahead of time so you make sure you're getting the appropriate message types for the use case that you're planning for, the appropriate severity levels. That way you won't be overwhelmed with all of these thousands of event messages that you don't really need. Another important step when you're doing your planning would be to make a list of all the IT assets you need to monitor. And that, again, should be matched up with your use case. And you also want to make a list of the owner or the administrator that's responsible for each of those devices. You want to make sure you include those people pretty early in your planning processes so there's no surprises and that you have a smooth rollout when you try to collect data from them. Another tip to reduce complexity would be to ask your potential SIEM vendors how they handle the data collection. So do you need to install an agent on a device? Is there a complicated connector required? And you need to know all those things ahead of time so you know what you're getting into. And you want to try to choose a solution that reduces the complexity rather than making it worse. And then be aware that SIEM solutions will come with hundreds of alerts and reports out of the box. This is a big selling point that a lot of the vendors are out there pushing. But really, you don't want to turn all those things on at once. You're going to be overwhelmed and you're going to get too much noise. So I really recommend taking an iterative approach. Only turn on the things that you need to meet your specific use cases. Make sure you tune the system to get what you're looking for, and then you can go back and tackle use case number 2 and start turning on more alerts, more reports. Then go back and tackle use case number 3. And that way, you're tuning the system to what you need one at a time so that you're not overwhelmed. And make sure you're realistic about how much time you can devote to that process. One thing you may want to consider is a managed service. If you decide, realistically, I don't have time to do this tuning and tweaking, consider a managed service for that. Next challenge that also comes along with SIEM a lot of the time is hidden costs. They're notorious for having a lot more cost behind it than the initial purchase price. As I just mentioned, be prepared to spend a lot of man-hours tuning and tweaking the system. This means you should expect some personnel costs for monitoring as well as maintaining the SIEM. Many SIEM solutions also require expensive professional services from the vendors. The vendors make a lot of money doing this because they'll charge you to build connectors for your devices. So make sure you factor this cost into your calculation. Again, there are some managed services out there that will include that as part of the package. So make sure you figure out, is that integration work included or am I paying extra for that? And then lastly, be sure to consider the ongoing cost of owning and operating the infrastructure. So that would include the server and all the upkeep that goes along with that, as well as your software maintenance. So the best way to avoid surprises is really to carefully consider all the options ahead of time before you procure it and go to deploy it. One option would be to purchase the software outright. This is the traditional way SIEM is done, where you're buying a software package, you own it, you install it, and it's yours. But you also have the option to use a cloud subscription software, and that can avoid some of the large upfront costs that go along with that. And EIQ, we actually offer the best of both worlds through a subscription-based solution that can be deployed on-premises or in the cloud. So there's lots of options for deployment model that you should think about, and which meets your budget, which meets your ongoing expense model. You should also carefully consider your personnel costs. It might make sense to outsource some of the tasks or all of the tasks to a service provider, or use services that can extend the capabilities of your team if you already have one. And that would be more of a hybrid approach. And lastly, make sure you understand how well your devices are supported by the SIEM vendor that you're choosing, and what happens if a particular log source is unsupported. Is there a fee to add support? And a lot of vendors now have some tools where you can actually build your own support. We call it the universal parser in our product. Other vendors have other names, but make sure you understand if that's something that's available to you. Squeezing security value out of a SIEM can be stressful. The console and the reports often provide a bit of information overload. And unfortunately, many SIEM solutions that are deployed for security or compliance reasons never get fully utilized. They're often sitting around collecting dust a year or two later. So that's something we want to avoid. And some tips for getting security value. The first thing would really be you got to think like a hacker. So how would someone try to get in? What would they do after they're inside? And how would I detect someone like that? And once you've got that thought process, that informs the rest of the steps you take to try to get security value out of your SIEM. So you're going to try to, after you build those threat models, the next thing would be to collect and build correlation rules that actually address those specific threat models. And this will help you cut down on all the noise and actually focus on the events and the patterns that are related to your security concerns. It's pretty much a given today that people are going to get inside your perimeter with all of the targeted phishing attacks and advanced threats. Just collecting from the perimeter devices isn't really going to cut it anymore. So make sure you're looking at collecting from applications and databases that are inside your perimeter to detect people once they've gotten in. And then most importantly, ask yourself if your team has the right people for doing all this detection. And if so, do they also have time to spend on tuning and monitoring the system? Today, many IT teams are pretty short-handed. Budgets are tight, so it might make sense to offload some of those tasks to a service provider who's got some deep security knowledge and also knowledge of SIEM products, because there's a learning curve with SIEM. And then the last challenge with SIEM, and it's true of many security products, I don't want to pick on SIEM, is that they're pretty reactive in nature. So they're going to alert you after something bad has already happened. And the longer it takes to detect and respond to an incident, that's usually going to lead to a higher cost of a security incident. So how to get more proactive? Usually the best way to do that is to implement security controls. Incident detection still remains a pretty important part of information security, but it's pretty critical to be proactive these days with the advanced threats that are out there. If you need some guidance on which security controls to implement, the SANS Institute and the Council on Cybersecurity are pretty good resources there. They've got their top 20 critical security controls. That's a good place to start. And then many of the regulations like PCI also have controls that they mandate. I've highlighted a few here, which I think are pretty critical. One is just restricting changes to your IT assets. And if you're not able to restrict them, I at least want to know that something changed so I can determine what it was and whether it should have happened. A few things to check for would be, have new devices appeared on the network? And are they authorized devices? If so, that's fine, but I want to make sure they're up to date on all their patches. I want to make sure that the security settings are correct. I need to know whenever there's a new device. I also want to know whenever new software is installed. It might be legit or it might be malware. I need to know about it. And even if it is installed for a legitimate purpose, I want to make sure there's no vulnerabilities in that software. And then I want to make sure all my firewalls, routers, servers, I want to make sure they're configured to match my organization's standards. And if anything changes on those, I need to know before something bad happens, before they can be exploited. Some other important security controls to consider. One is monitoring the anti-malware software. You've purchased it, you've installed it, but is it actually running? How can you tell? So you want to be able to check on that and make sure it's actually active, up to date, and protecting all of your endpoints. Is there an easy way to restrict the ports and protocols that your systems are using? Being able to limit those communication ports and protocols is a great way to prevent vulnerabilities from being exploited. So when you're looking at a security monitoring solution, you want to start asking questions like, how can I use this SIEM or other tool to implement some of these controls? And lastly, is there a way that I can actively check for some of the zero-day vulnerabilities that are out there? There's a new one in the news every week. There's not a signature built for it yet in a lot of the security products. So how can I use my SIEM or security monitoring product to detect those? So SIEM can be a very powerful tool if it's deployed well. Hopefully these tips give you something to think about as you're continuing your research. And I'll talk a little bit more about what EIQ does to help. SecureView is our flagship security intelligence platform. It is a SIEM and log management solution, but it's also a lot more than that. We provide the ability to continuously monitor 9 of the SANS 20 critical controls. And we also give you the ability to audit your asset configurations against industry standards. So if you want to check your configurations against DISA STIGs or CIS benchmarks, or even your own custom policies, we provide the ability to continuously monitor those. We've been doing this for a long time, so we've designed SecureView to help overcome some of those challenges we were talking about. The other offering we have is called SOCView. SOCView is a security monitoring solution which is perfect for organizations that don't really want to face these challenges on their own. So SOCView provides a team of knowledgeable professionals who install, configure, and monitor SecureView either on your premises or we offer it in the cloud. And the great part is our SOC analysts will monitor for threats 24/7. They'll do the tuning to tune out the false positives before they get to you. And they'll quickly alert you when there's security incidents that you really need to know about. They also give you some remediation guidance on what to do about those incidents. And the way we like to think of it is the SOC team at EIQ is an extension of your team. So they'll help you proactively implement security controls and continuously assess them. And by doing that, you can be a lot more proactive and improve your security posture, lower the risk of a data breach from happening in the first place. So with that, I'd invite you to visit our website for more information. It's www.eiqnetworks.com. If you are interested in a SIEM standalone product that you manage yourself, that's SecureView, and we can set up a demo of it. If you are interested in learning more about our SOCView service, we also have a free trial that you can try it out in your own environment. And with that, I'll turn it over for questions and answers.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to jump right into the Q&A portion. Our first question is, do you have any cost estimates for staffing?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna vary, pretty widely depending on where in the world you are. In the U.S., I think if you look at Glassdoor or Salary.com on some of those sites, you can get a pretty good estimate. A security analyst or a security administrator type role seems to range in the $70,000 to $80,000 a year range. So if you wanted one person to manage your SIEM, that's probably what you're looking at. If you want to run around-the-clock coverage, then you probably need to multiply that number by 3, so you're up over $200,000 now. Do you really need 24/7 coverage? Well, that's something your organization would need to figure out, but like I mentioned, the longer it takes for you to respond to an incident, the higher the cost. So I won't say it's right for everyone, but something to consider.
Got it. What's the best way to compare server and cloud costs?
Right. So you've got the option of running these on-site or using a cloud provider. The cloud costs are usually pretty well understood. Those are usually quoted in a price per month. Maybe there might be a few variables like how long the data is stored that you'd need to look at. The tricky part is probably on the server cost. So you're looking at the cost to purchase the hardware and the software licenses, as well as all the ongoing things like patching it, maintaining it, the energy usage, the replacement costs. So there are some calculators out there on the web that I would say, it would probably give you a pretty good estimate when you're trying to compare the two.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, what's the typical skill level for people using SIEM?
That really depends on the role. There's a few ways you could structure it. If it's someone who's just going to be doing the monitoring and they see an alert and they gather all the data and then send it to someone else to do something about it, that could probably be a relatively entry-level position. If the role is going to be someone who does the monitoring and also does the response, then you probably want someone with some pretty strong security knowledge, someone a little more experienced, probably someone who's got a certification like a CISSP. And then if that person's also going to be managing the product, they'll probably want to get a vendor certification on the SIEM platform to make sure they really know how to use it.
Okay.
So I guess it depends on the role.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Do you have any advice on which logs to collect first?
Again, it depends on your situation. So this goes back to documenting your use case. And if your use case is PCI compliance, and that's a pretty common one, the big thing there is they really stress collecting from the firewalls and the routers and the switches. So that's probably a good place to start for PCI. HIPAA seems a little bit more focused on access controls and auditing who has access to health data. So if HIPAA is your use case, it might make sense to start with any kind of authentication events for systems that store patient data. If threat detection is your use model, again, authentication is probably a good one to start with, because if anybody's going to do anything bad with your data, they need access to it. So you want to see who's authenticating, who's changing access levels, who's changing permissions. So collecting all those logs would be pretty important.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, got it. We do have to close out this session now, but I'd like to extend a big thank you to you, Kevin Lance of EIQ, for this insight. Of course, I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in today. This webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website. And as a reminder, we will push all of our listeners over to the booth at the close of this webcast. So please join us next time.